What if I told you that one of the most powerful German tanks ever built was destroyed not by a superior machine, but by a tank the Germans openly mocked, underestimated, and even laughed at? What if the fate of a battlefield didn't depend on armor thickness or gun size, but on a single moment of confusion? A moment when German crews couldn't recognize the tank charging straight toward them. For years, historians said the Sherman didn't stand a chance against the Panther, but there was one battle, one day, and one tank that changed everything. A day when fear and certainty collapsed into shock and disbelief. By the end of this story, you'll know exactly how the tank the Germans dismissed, the weak Sherman, stood in front of their most feared weapon and shattered a legend. On September 19, 1944, the morning fog over the French countryside hung low like a veil, clinging to the fields and choking visibility to just a few dozen meters. The air was thick with silence, unnatural silence, the kind that comes only on the eve of battle. The men of the American 4th Armored Division sat quietly inside their tanks, engines idling, radios crackling with static, breath fogging inside the steel shells that surrounded them. They didn't know it yet, but today they were going to face one of the greatest armored threats of World War II, and they were going to face it in the least expected vehicle, the Sherman medium tank. The Sherman was not a tank soldiers bragged about. It wasn't feared for its armor, and it wasn't admired for its gun. The Germans called it Tommy cookers, convinced that the thin armor and gasoline engines made it easy to ignite. Compared to the Panther, the Sherman was outclassed in almost every visible way. The Panther had a long, high-velocity 75mm cannon capable of punching holes through Allied tanks at great distance. Its sloped armor was innovative, bouncing shots that would have shattered other tanks. And to top it off, the Panther had become a symbol, a weapon the German army believed would turn the war in their favor. On paper, the Sherman had no business winning. But war rarely follows the rules written on paper. The American crews knew the Panther was coming long before they could see it. Intelligence reports warned that German armored units were pushing through the French countryside, making their way toward the town of Arracourt. The Germans believed that if they could recapture this strategic point, they might stop the American advance into eastern France and secure a path to reorganize. But the Germans also believed they were driving into battle against weaker, unprepared American forces. They didn't know that the U.S. armored crews here had combat experience, radio coordination, battlefield tactics, and perhaps most importantly, weather conditions in their favor. The fog did something strange that morning. It erased the assumptions both sides carried into the fight. As American Tank Commander Lieutenant James Carpenter peered through his periscope, he could barely make out the shapes of hedgerows and trees. Everything beyond that was swallowed in gray. Inside his Sherman, his crew spoke in low, nervous voices. Private O'Leary, the gunner, tapped the side of the turret rhythmically, an unconscious habit he admitted began every time he felt death might be near. The men weren't afraid of the Panther specifically, they were afraid of not seeing it until it was too late. The Panther was famous for long-range kills, but long-range didn't exist inside the morning fog. Just after 800 hours, the first faint engine sounds rolled in from the northeast, deep, slow, powerful. Carpenter knew instantly what they belonged to. Only German armor had that sound. He ordered his radio operator to send the message across the net. Panthers approaching, multiple engines, close distance. Across the American lines, Sherman commanders froze. They were about to face tanks that could destroy them with a single shot. But Carpenter knew something the Germans didn't. Panthers had a weakness in fog. Their optics and rangefinders were designed for distance. Here, visibility worked against them. Minutes later, a shadow emerged, a massive shape, moving slow, cautious, unsure. It was a panther. Its turret swiveled left, then right, searching for targets, unable to see through the fog. Carpenter steadied his breathing. O'Leary whispered, "Jesus, look at the size of that thing." But something else happened in that moment, something critical. The Panther did not recognize the Sherman. At this close range, at this strange angle, through this thick air, the Americans were just dark shapes. For several seconds, the two tanks stared at each other, silent predators in a misty field. Then the Panther fired. Carpenter felt the ground shake as the shell ripped past them, missing by inches. The concussion rattled the Sherman violently, and before Carpenter could speak, O'Leary shouted, "Target up! Fire!" The Sherman's 75mm cannon boomed. The recoil slammed through the hull as the shell struck the Panther low on the hull plate. Sparks exploded across its armor. It wasn't enough to destroy it, not yet, but it was enough to shock the German crew. The Panther lurched backward, trying to reposition, trying to identify the enemy. Carpenter yelled for a second round. Again, the Sherman fired. This time, the shot pierced through the side armor, the Panther's weak spot. Flames erupted inside the German tank. Smoke poured from its vents. The crew scrambled desperately, trying to escape, screaming commands in German, but the fire spread too fast. Within seconds, the Panther, the pride of Hitler's armored divisions, was burning. Its ammunition began detonating one shell at a time, echoing across the field like distant thunder. O'Leary lowered his head and whispered, stunned, "We got him." Across the battlefield, other Shermans heard the explosion and turned toward the sound. Through the haze, they saw the burning silhouette of the Panther, and disbelief washed over them. For months, they had been told the Panther was untouchable at close range, that they were outmatched, that survival against these tanks depended on luck or overwhelming numbers. But here, a single Sherman, operating alone, had destroyed the German machine that soldiers feared most. Word spread quickly across radio channels. Crews who had never believed their armor could stand against a Panther suddenly felt something strange, confidence. But the Germans felt something else, shock. Inside the command Panther, farther up the road, German officer Captain Albrecht Weber stared through binoculars, trying to understand what he was seeing. One of his Panthers, destroyed, and by what? In the fog, he couldn't tell. Sherman's silhouettes had weird profiles when seen at angles. The Germans had misidentified American tanks before, thinking they were smaller vehicles or even captured armor. But this was different. In the mist, the Sherman that killed the Panther almost looked unfamiliar. Weber hesitated. His men waited. The fog thickened. More German tanks rolled forward, unaware that the battlefield had tilted against them. Carpenter and his crew did not retreat after the kill. They pushed forward. The burning Panther was still glowing when they passed it. The Sherman rumbled across churned mud, exhaust fumes trailing behind, turrets scanning right and left. Carpenter knew the first kill was luck mixed with skill, but luck did not last forever. Somewhere in the haze, more Panthers were waiting, and unlike the first one, they would not be surprised. Yet something deeper had changed inside the American tank crew. They had done the impossible. They had shattered the myth. They had destroyed the machine everyone feared. And they were about to learn that the Germans still had plenty of fight left in them. The fog lifted slightly, and what Carpenter saw next made his heart stop. Another Panther, then another, and another. 3 German tanks, side by side, emerging from the gray like ghosts. The Sherman slowed. No one spoke. No one breathed. The radio crackled, asking for contact, but Carpenter couldn't answer. He stared at the 3 Panthers ahead and realized the truth. This battle wasn't won. It was just beginning. The three Panthers ahead of Carpenter sat motionless for a moment, their silhouettes half-formed in the gray mist like creatures caught between worlds. The fog shifted in drifting waves, rolling through the fields and curling around the trees. Every few seconds, the Panthers would fade, then reappear, like ghosts taunting the living. Carpenter felt the weight of their presence pressing down on him, a silent threat that seeped into his bones. He knew that at this distance, despite the fog, the Germans would soon identify his Sherman. Once they did, one shot from those 75mm cannons would tear straight through their armor and obliterate every man inside. The silence stretched out into eternity, and Carpenter could feel sweat sliding down the back of his neck inside his helmet, cold as ice. He looked at O'Leary and saw the same fear hiding behind his gunner's determined stare. O'Leary swallowed hard, his jaw set, his finger hovering near the trigger. The German tanks began to move, slowly at first, like giants waking from slumber. Their engines growled through the air, deep, resonant, powerful, a sound that made the Sherman feel small, almost fragile by comparison. Carpenter could sense the men behind those Panther turrets. He could imagine their confidence returning. In their minds, the first Panther had died because of confusion or bad luck. Now they were regrouped, focused, and ready. Carpenter ordered his driver to reverse into the small dip in the earth behind them. The Sherman chassis trembled as its treads churned the soft, damp soil beneath them, sliding slightly before finding grip. They ducked low behind the natural cover. They had seconds to act. Through the fog, the Panthers lined up, creating a staggered formation. Their turrets turned as one, like a synchronized machine, scanning the field, searching for the American tank. Carpenter ordered the turret to swing left and elevate slightly. O'Leary adjusted the sight, waiting for one of the Panthers to reveal enough of its hull or flank. The fog played tricks on the eyes. Distances felt distorted, shapes warped and stretched. The battlefield had become something otherworldly, as if the war itself existed in a different dimension here. Sound seemed louder, echoing unnaturally. Every crack, every engine growl, every shifting branch carried a threat. Then came a noise that sent every nerve in Carpenter's body jolting to full alert, the metallic slam of a shot being fired. One of the Panthers opened fire, the shell screaming through the fog and striking the earth barely 20 meters to their right, erupting in mud and fire. The explosion rocked the Sherman violently, shaking loose dust and debris inside the crew compartment. Carpenter yelled for O'Leary to fire, but the gunner couldn't see well enough to take a clean shot. The Panthers fired again. Carpenter's ears rang, and for a moment he lost his sense of direction. The fog flashed brightly from the blast, then returned to silence. They needed a plan, and they needed it now. Without warning, the radio crackled to life. Another Sherman crew, part of their unit, had moved in from the south. Their voices cut through the static, eager and breathless. Carpenter responded, giving brief coordinates and describing the Panther's position. The other American tank commander acknowledged and swung wide around a cluster of trees, approaching the Panthers from an angle. Carpenter felt a spark of hope. He still knew that the Sherman was at a disadvantage, but now there was another tank, another gun, another chance. The Panthers continued advancing, oblivious to the second Sherman approaching from their flank. The German tank crews were focused on Carpenter's position. They believed that was where the threat remained. Carpenter could sense their confidence, the way they pushed forward aggressively now, convinced they could overpower the single enemy tank ahead. He watched their silhouettes move with purpose, powerful, majestic in their deadly precision, but their confidence was also their weakness. O'Leary steadied the turret, locking his eyes into the sight. Carpenter could feel him adjusting his breath, letting fear melt into focus. The Panther on the far right exposed more of its side armor as it crept forward. The fog gave just enough clarity to aim for the area above the track, where armor was thinner. Carpenter whispered, "Now!" O'Leary pulled the trigger.
The Sherman roared. The shell blasted forward, disappearing into the mist, then struck the Panther's right side near its rear wheel. A thunderous clang echoed through the valley. Sparks flew. The Panther jerked violently. Its engine sputtered, clanking and choking in protest. Carpenter watched through narrowing fog as the German tank slowly ground to a halt, immobilized. It wasn't destroyed, not yet, but it was trapped, dead in the water.
The crew inside the damaged Panther panicked. They tried to rotate the turret, trying to angle the cannon toward the Shermans, but their movement was too slow. The second Sherman struck from the flank, catching them off guard. Carpenter heard the distinct boom echo across the field. A second round slammed into the side of the disabled Panther, this time near the ammunition rack. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening roar, the Panther erupted into flames. The explosion sent shards of metal flying, and a plume of thick black smoke curled into the sky. Carpenter didn't have time to watch. The remaining two Panthers were still advancing. The battlefield changed in an instant. The Panthers were no longer hunters. They had become prey. But Carpenter knew better than to celebrate early. The Germans were smart, disciplined, and unshakably aggressive. The two surviving Panthers quickly rotated their turrets toward the second Sherman, recognizing the threat that had just destroyed their companion. Carpenter yelled into the radio, warning his ally to pull back, but it was too late. The German tank crew, now fully aware, fired a single, precise shot through the fog. The shell hit the American Sherman dead center. The explosion shook the earth. Carpenter froze. Through the haze, he saw flames crackle along the hull of the second Sherman. There was no movement, no radio signal, no sound from the man inside. The battlefield absorbed the loss in chilling silence. Carpenter felt the shock ripple through his own crew. O'Leary's breathing quickened. Their drivers' hands shook on the controls. Even Carpenter felt doubt claw its way into his thoughts. 1 moment ago, they were part of a two-tank offensive. Now they were alone again. The Panthers pressed forward, their engines rumbling louder, a sound that felt like doom itself creeping toward them. Carpenter steadied himself. He had to keep his crew alive. He ordered the Sherman to move north, using the uneven terrain to mask their movement. The tank bumped violently over rocks and ruts, engine growling in protest as it dragged its weight through thick mud. The fog swirled tighter, a living presence, twisting through the air with every gust of wind. Carpenter strained to see through his optics, heart pounding as he scanned for the Panthers' silhouettes. He knew the Germans would come after them now, not cautiously, not slowly, but aggressively. They had lost one of their tanks. They would want revenge. And Carpenter's Sherman, the tank that killed their first Panther, would be their primary target. He guided his crew into a shallow depression, barely enough to conceal them, and waited. Time stretched thin. O'Leary tracked the Panther on the left, trying to steady his aim despite the limited visibility. The Panther on the right moved forward quickly, attempting to flank their position. Carpenter realized what they were doing. They were trying to box him in, to force him into the open. He ordered the driver to swing the Sherman hard left. The tank lurched forward, mud flying behind it, engine roaring as they climbed out of the dip and charged toward the right-hand Panther. The movement was reckless, insane, and shocking. And that was exactly why it worked. The Panthers expected fear. Instead, they saw aggression. The German crews hesitated, unsure of what to make of the Sherman's sudden maneuver. Carpenter aimed straight for the Panther trying to flank them. The two tanks closed in fast, the fog thinning just enough for them to see each other clearly. Carpenter could almost see the outlines of the German crew through their periscope, faces blurred by distance and smoke. The Sherman gun fired again. The shell struck the Panther's turret ring with a metallic scream, ricocheting upward harmlessly. O'Leary cursed under his breath. The Panther rotated its cannon toward them. Carpenter braced for the end. Then, from across the field, came the unmistakable sound of multiple tank engines, not German, but American. Reinforcements, Shermans. Carpenter felt a surge of adrenaline. The Panthers paused, sensing the shift. One of the German tanks rotated to face the incoming Americans, unsure whether to stand and fight or withdraw. The fog lifted slightly, and black silhouettes appeared along the horizon, more Shermans rolling toward the battle. Carpenter knew this was their moment. He ordered O'Leary to fire one more shot before the Panthers repositioned. The cannon thundered, smoke filling the interior. The shell flew true, striking near the rear of the Panther's turret. Sparks erupted. The turret jammed in place. Flames flickered. The Panther ground to a halt, crippled. The final German tank hesitated, turret whipping between Carpenter's Sherman and the approaching American battalion. The battlefield trembled with engine noise as the Shermans closed in. The last Panther, once a symbol of German armored superiority, turned and began to retreat into the fog. Carpenter stared as the massive tank backed away into the fog, disappearing into the shifting gray clouds from which it had emerged. The battlefield went silent again. No gunfire, no explosions, just the distant sound of German engines fading into the mist. The men inside Carpenter's Sherman sat still, stunned by what had just happened. They had destroyed 2 Panthers, forced a third to withdraw, and they had survived. But Carpenter knew, deep in his gut, the battle wasn't over. Germany had more Panthers. The fog would lift, and they had only seen the first chapter of the fight for Arracourt. He didn't yet know that the next engagement would be even deadlier, and that the Germans, humiliated, were already preparing to return, stronger, angrier, and determined to prove the Panther's superiority once and for all. The morning fog finally began to loosen its grip on the battlefield, peeling away in slow, ghost-like strands, revealing the scorched earth beneath. Broken tracks, smoking armor, and scattered remnants of the fight lay across the field like scars carved into the land. Carpenter watched as the rising sun struggled to break through the lingering haze, stretching pale light across the charred remains of the first Panther they had destroyed. The smell of burning metal clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. Inside the Sherman, the crew was quiet, each man processing the chaos they had just survived. O'Leary leaned back from the gun sight, rubbing his exhausted eyes. The loader, Winston, checked their remaining ammunition silently, his hands moving mechanically as though he were afraid to disrupt the fragile calm that had settled over them. Even the driver, Hawthorne, had become motionless, staring ahead at the battlefield through the narrow plexiglass slit in the hull, lost in thought. Carpenter finally looked away from the fading Panther silhouette and studied the terrain ahead. The last German tank had disappeared into the fog, but he knew that was not the end of it. The Germans had withdrawn not because they were defeated, but because they were regrouping. Carpenter felt a heaviness in his chest at that realization. The 4th Armored Division had won these few minutes of quiet, but victory itself was still distant. The Germans wanted Arracourt back, and they would not give up easily. Carpenter ordered the driver to advance slowly, guiding the Sherman toward higher ground where they could get a better vantage point. As the tank crawled over the muddied earth, its engine groaned, tired and battered, just like the men inside. The radio crackled again. Command was relaying reports. Multiple German armored units were converging toward their sector, Panthers and Panzer IVs mixed together, supported by infantry. Carpenter could feel the tension rise inside the tank with every word. If the Germans attacked in force, they could overwhelm the American lines before reinforcements were ready. Carpenter and his men had already pushed their Sherman beyond expectations. They had fought against impossible odds, exploited the fog, turned confusion into advantage, and survived encounters that should have killed them. But now the fight would be different. The fog was lifting, visibility was returning, distance would matter again, and in a long-range duel, the Panther would reclaim its dominance. Carpenter climbed partially out of the turret, letting his head break into the open air. He scanned the horizon with his binoculars. The morning sun, though weak, gave enough clarity for him to spot dark shapes emerging in the distance. More German armor. They were far away, but unmistakable. The line of vehicles crept forward like a steel wave, rising over ridges and sinking into valleys, slow and methodical. Carpenter ducked back inside and ordered full radio contact with nearby American tanks. They needed to form a defensive line. They needed a coordinated counterattack. The Shermans responded, voices tight but eager. The men in those tanks had heard what happened in the fog. They knew Carpenter's crew had destroyed Panthers. That kind of victory echoed fast, spreading belief. The men knew fear, but fear was not stronger than pride. Soon, other Shermans arrived, their engines roaring to life beside Carpenter's. Turrets turned, cannons lifted, radios buzzed. The battlefield, once silent, now pulsed with movement. Carpenter's tank took position along the crest of a small hill. O'Leary sighted the gun, lining up his view as the loader held a high explosive shell at the ready. Carpenter could feel his heart pounding again, that familiar rhythm of adrenaline mixed with dread. He thought briefly about the men inside those approaching Panthers, their lives, their hopes, their fears. War did not offer sympathy, only survival. The Germans began firing first. Shells tore through the ground, ripping dirt into the air. One round passed over the Shermans and detonated behind them, shaking the hilltop. Carpenter yelled orders to adjust position. The Shermans scattered slightly, moving along the ridge to spread out their silhouette. O'Leary fired the first American shot of the engagement. The cannon roar shook their bones, and they watched the shell arc through the air, striking the lead Panther's hull. The armor dented but did not break. The Panther continued forward, unfazed. The loader rammed another shell into the breach, sweat dripping from his brow, fingers trembling with urgency. O'Leary fired again. This round struck higher, near the turret. Sparks flew, and the Panther's gun wavered, but still it pressed on. Carpenter cursed under his breath. The Panthers were closing distance, using their thick armor and powerful guns to break the Americans' line. Another German shell slammed into a Sherman 2 tanks over. The explosion blew the turret hatch open, flames licking across the metal surface. The crew inside didn't make it out. Carpenter saw the smoke rising, dark and brutal, marking the loss of friends, brothers, soldiers. The surviving Shermans held their ground, firing desperately to stop the advancing armor. The air trembled with the thunder of cannons. The smell of cordite and burning fuel filled every breath. The Germans continued to push forward. One Panther mounted the ridge, gaining height and visibility. Its turret swung toward Carpenter. O'Leary saw it through the scope, froze for a fist-shaped second, then fired. The shot struck square on the Panther's front armor and shattered harmlessly. The German cannon fired back immediately. The round screamed past Carpenter's Sherman, slicing through the air like a streak of lightning. Carpenter ordered the driver to reverse down the slope to avoid a direct hit, but the tank slowed as gears ground against mud and stone. The Panther adjusted its aim. Carpenter braced for the blast. Then something unexpected happened. A sound rose behind them, the roar of aircraft engines cutting through the sky. American fighter bombers streaked overhead, their silhouettes growing larger as they swooped low. The Panthers, caught in the open, could not maneuver fast enough. The planes released their rockets, streaks of fire trailing behind them. Explosions ripped across the ridge. One Panther was struck dead center, bursting into flames. Another had its track blown off, leaving it stranded. The battlefield erupted into chaos. The German offensive faltered, their formation shattered. The American Sherman surged forward with renewed force. Carpenter ordered an advance, urging his crew to seize the moment. Their Sherman rolled up the hill again, engine roaring, turret aimed toward the immobilized Panther. O'Leary fired a high-explosive shell into the exposed flank. The explosion tore through the armor. Flames consumed the tank in seconds. German soldiers scrambled from the wreckage, diving for cover. Carpenter pushed onward. The remaining Panthers were retreating, trying to escape the airstrike and regroup. O'Leary tracked another target, fired, and struck the rear hull. Smoke burst from the Panther as it lurched forward, dying slowly. The battle surged downward into the valley. Shermans pursued the retreating German armor, firing as they advanced, engines and treads screaming in exertion. Carpenter watched the Panthers shrink across the open field. They were no longer predators, they were hunted. The men inside the Sherman felt the shift, the weight lifting. Fear turned to fierce determination. They moved like a machine, loader, gunner, driver, commander, each man perfectly synchronized now, hardened by experience and driven by the memory of fallen crews. By midday, the battlefield had transformed completely. Smoke columns rose like black pillars across the horizon. Disabled German tanks smoldered in the grass. American tanks encircled the ridge, maintaining defensive positions and scanning for any returning forces. Carpenter slowly stepped out of the turret and stood atop the Sherman, helmet under his arm. He surveyed the field in silence. It was over. Not just the engagement, the myth. That myth that the Panther was unbeatable, untouchable, unstoppable. Carpenter's unit had destroyed Panthers before, but this was different. Today, they had turned back a full armored attack. Today, the Panther had lost not just a battle, but its legend. American command later said the engagement at Arracourt became one of the most impressive defensive armored actions of the entire war. And at the heart of it stood the Sherman, the tank everyone said was inferior, the tank the Germans mocked, the tank that wasn't supposed to win. It did not win because of superior design or raw firepower. It won because of teamwork, communication, mobility, tactical use of terrain, and relentless will. And because of something else, something the Panthers could never match: adaptability. The Sherman tank was not perfect, but it was dependable. It could maneuver fast. It could fire quickly. It could coordinate with air and infantry support. And most importantly, it was crewed by men who refused to stop fighting. Carpenter watched his crew climb out of the Sherman, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. O'Leary leaned against the turret, exhausted, staring at the burning Panthers. Hawthorne walked around the tank, stretching his legs and breathing deeply. Winston looked up at the sky, at the fading trails of American aircraft, as though searching for meaning in their smoky lines. Carpenter felt something powerful in that moment. They had survived. They had made it through an experience few ever would, and they had helped carve a victory into the very ground beneath them. Weeks later, historians would write that the Panther had been the superior machine, but the Sherman had been the superior weapon. Not because of steel or firepower, but because of the men inside it, and because war is not won on paper. It is won by decision, action, timing, and will. Carpenter never forgot the fog, the silence, the sound of German engines approaching, the shock when the first Panther exploded, the dread when the second Sherman burned, and the roar of American planes rising above the battlefield to turn the tide. Every detail lived with him forever. But one memory stood above the rest. The moment the Germans realized their greatest tank, the Panther, their armored pride, could be destroyed by the very machine they had once laughed at. The weak Sherman. The tank that wasn't supposed to win. The tank that did.